On June 14, 1903, in the small town of Bellefonte, Pennsylvania, Margaret Hayes and Thomas Brennan stood before a photographer's camera on what should have been the happiest day of their lives. They had just been married at St. John's Catholic Church in a modest ceremony attended by family and close friends. The photograph shows them as countless wedding portraits did in that era. Margaret in her white lace dress, holding a small bouquet of lilies, Thomas in his best dark suit, standing proudly beside his new bride. Both looked directly at the camera with the subtle, restrained smiles common in early 1900s photography. The photographer, Robert Whitmore, later noted that it was a perfectly ordinary wedding portrait of a perfectly ordinary young couple starting their life together. The photograph was delivered to Margaret's parents 3 days later, as the couple had already left on their honeymoon to Niagara Falls. Except they never arrived at Niagara Falls, and they were never seen again. For 116 years, this wedding photograph remained in the Hayes family attic, tucked in a box with Margaret's belongings, a haunting image of a couple who vanished on their wedding night, leaving behind only questions and this single photograph. Until 2019, when Margaret's great-great-niece found the photo and began investigating what really happened that night. What she discovered wasn't just a missing persons case. It was something far stranger. Subscribe now. The photograph arrived in the mail to Emma Rodriguez in March 2019, sent by her elderly aunt Patricia, who was cleaning out the family home in Bellefonte, Pennsylvania, before moving to assisted living. "I found this in the attic," Patricia's note read. "It's your great-great-aunt Margaret's wedding photo. I thought you might want it for your genealogy research. There's a strange story behind it. Ask your mother about the couple who disappeared. I never knew all the details." Emma, a 34-year-old high school history teacher in Philadelphia with a passion for family genealogy, immediately called her mother. "Oh God, Margaret and Thomas," her mother said when Emma mentioned the names. "I haven't thought about them in years. My grandmother, your great-grandmother, used to tell the story. Margaret was her aunt. She disappeared on her wedding night in 1903. Both of them did. Margaret and her new husband. Just vanished. Nobody ever found out what happened to them." Emma felt a chill run down her spine. She looked at the photograph more closely. It was a formal studio portrait, the kind that were standard for weddings in the early 1900s. The photograph measured approximately 8 by 10 inches, mounted on thick cardboard backing. The image was sepia-toned, showing a young couple standing side by side. Margaret Hayes appeared to be in her early 20s, wearing a high-necked white lace wedding dress with long sleeves and a modest train visible at her feet. Her dark hair was styled in the Gibson girl fashion popular at the time, swept up and back. She wore no veil in the photograph, likely removed for the portrait, but held a small bouquet of white lilies in her gloved hands. Her expression was pleasant, with a subtle smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Thomas Brennan stood beside her, slightly taller, also appearing to be in his mid-20s. He wore a dark 3-piece suit with a high-collared white shirt and dark tie. His hair was neatly parted and pomaded in the style of the era. One hand rested formally at his side. The other was positioned behind Margaret's back, not quite touching her. Proper formal distance for photography of that era. Both looked directly at the camera with the slightly stiff, formal poses common in early photography, when exposure times still required subjects to remain motionless for several seconds. Behind them was the standard painted backdrop used in photography studios of the period, a nondescript interior scene suggesting a formal parlor with columns and drapery. At the bottom of the photograph, embossed in gold lettering on the cardboard mount, were the words, Whitmore Photography Studio, Bellefonte, Pennsylvania, June 14, 1903. Emma turned the photograph over. On the back, written in faded pencil in elegant cursive handwriting, was an inscription, Margaret Elizabeth Hayes and Thomas Michael Brennan. Married June 14, 1903, St. John's Catholic Church. God protect them on their journey. The last line sent another chill through Emma. God protect them on their journey. It seemed like a standard wedding blessing, except that her mother had just told her they had disappeared. Emma immediately began researching. She started with census records, death certificates, newspaper archives, anything that might tell her what happened to Margaret Hayes and Thomas Brennan after their wedding day in 1903. What she found was stranger than she could have imagined. There were newspaper articles, lots of them. The disappearance of the newlywed couple had been major news in Pennsylvania in the summer of 1903, and the story they told was absolutely baffling. Emma found the first newspaper article in the digital archives of the Bellefonte Democratic Watchman, dated June 19, 1903, just 5 days after the wedding. The headline read, Local Newlyweds Missing. Couple Vanishes en route to honeymoon. Foul play suspected. The article reported, Grave concerns are mounting for the welfare of Mr. Thomas Brennan and his bride, the former Miss Margaret Hayes, who were married at St. John's Catholic Church this past Sunday. The couple departed Bellefonte on Sunday evening aboard the 7:15 train to Buffalo, from which they intended to travel to Niagara Falls for their wedding trip. However, they failed to arrive at the Cataract House Hotel, where reservations had been made in their name. Mr. Brennan's employer, the Titan Iron Works, has confirmed that Mr. Brennan requested 1 week's leave for his honeymoon and was expected to return to work on Monday next. The families of both bride and groom are deeply distressed and have appealed to authorities in Pennsylvania and New York to locate the missing couple. Emma found more articles as the story developed. June 22, 1903. Missing couple investigation deepens. No trace found of Bellefonte newlyweds. This article provided more details. Investigators have determined that Mr. Thomas Brennan, aged 26, and Mrs. Margaret Brennan, née Hayes, aged 23, did indeed board the Pennsylvania Railroad train, departing Bellefonte at 7:15 p.m. on Sunday, June 14th. The conductor on duty that evening, Mr. James Patterson, recalls seeing the couple board with their luggage, 2 trunks and a carpet bag, and take seats in the second passenger car. However, when the train arrived in Buffalo at approximately 11:45 p.m., the couple was not among the disembarking passengers. Most puzzling, their luggage was also missing. It is as though they vanished from a moving train. Emma read that line again. It is as though they vanished from a moving train. She found another article from June 28, 1903. Bizarre details emerge in newlywed disappearance. Fellow passengers report strange occurrence. This article was longer and more detailed. The Center Daily Times has learned of peculiar circumstances surrounding the disappearance of Thomas and Margaret Brennan. Multiple passengers who traveled on the same train have come forward with accounts that, while varying in certain particulars, agree on several disturbing points. Mrs. Elizabeth Thornton of Tyrone was seated 3 rows behind the Brennan couple. She reports that approximately 1 hour into the journey, as the train passed through the mountainous region near Altoona, Mrs. Brennan appeared to become agitated. She kept looking out the window, Mrs. Thornton stated, and saying something to her husband that I couldn't quite hear over the noise of the train. But she seemed frightened. The husband tried to calm her, but she became more distressed. Mr. Harold Chen, a traveling salesman from Philadelphia, was seated across the aisle from the couple. He corroborates Mrs. Thornton's account and adds a chilling detail. The young bride suddenly stood up and said quite clearly, "There's someone outside the window." Her husband looked out and his face went pale. He said, "That's impossible. We're moving." But they both stared out that window like they were seeing something terrible. Then the lights in our car flickered and went out for perhaps 10 or 15 seconds. When they came back on, the couple was gone. Their seats were empty. I assumed they had gone to another car during the darkness, but I never saw them again. Most disturbing of all is the testimony of Miss Sarah Whitmore, aged 16, who was traveling with her family. She claims that just before the lights went out, she heard Mrs. Brennan scream, "Don't let them take us!" The car was plunged into darkness, and in that darkness, Miss Whitmore reports hearing a sound like rushing wind and a smell like sulfur. When light was restored, the Brennan couple had vanished. Authorities are treating these accounts with skepticism, noting that train travel at night, especially through mountainous terrain, can play tricks on the senses. However, the undeniable fact remains. Thomas and Margaret Brennan boarded that train and never arrived at their destination. An intensive search of the route between Belafonte and Buffalo has revealed no trace of the couple or their belongings. Emma sat back from her computer screen, her heart pounding. This wasn't just a missing persons case. This was something genuinely unexplainable. Emma continued digging through newspaper archives, finding dozens of articles about the case throughout the summer and fall of 1903. The disappearance of Thomas and Margaret Brennan had become a sensation, not just in Pennsylvania, but nationally. Newspapers from New York to California covered the story, often with sensational headlines, "Newlyweds vanish into thin air," "The mystery of the ghost train." Did the devil take the Brennan couple? The investigation had been extensive. Pennsylvania State Police and railroad detectives searched every inch of the train route. They interviewed every passenger and crew member from that train. They searched the mountainous terrain along the tracks, looking for any sign that the couple might have jumped or fallen from the train. Nothing was found. No bodies, no luggage, no trace of them at all. Emma found an article from August 15th, 1903, that detailed the investigative findings. After 2 months of intensive investigation, authorities have been unable to explain the disappearance of Thomas and Margaret Brennan. Detective Samuel Morrison of the Pennsylvania State Police issued the following statement. "We have pursued every conceivable explanation. We have searched the entire rail route multiple times. We have dredged streams and ponds along the way. We have interviewed over 50 witnesses. We have found absolutely no evidence of foul play. No evidence of an accident. No evidence that the couple left the train at any of its stops before Buffalo. The train made no unscheduled stops that night. The doors to the passenger cars remained locked from the outside, as is standard procedure during movement. There is simply no rational explanation for how 2 people and their luggage could disappear from a locked, moving train car. Some have suggested the couple planned their own disappearance, that this was an elaborate scheme to start a new life elsewhere. However, neither individual had access to significant funds. Mr. Brennan's bank account contained approximately $47 at the time of the wedding. Miss Hayes had no independent income. Their families report no history of mental instability or desire to flee their lives. Both were well liked in their community and excited about their marriage. Others have suggested more supernatural explanations, While I respect that many people hold such beliefs, I am bound to work within the realm of established fact. The fact is that Thomas and Margaret Brennan vanished, and despite our best efforts, we cannot explain how or why. This case will remain open indefinitely. Emma found that the story gradually faded from newspapers as months passed with no new developments. By December 1903, articles about the Brennan disappearance had stopped appearing. She found one final article from June 14, 1904, exactly 1 year after the wedding, in the Bellefonte newspaper. 1 year later, Brennan mystery remains unsolved. Families hold memorial service. The article reported that both families had held a memorial service at St. John's Catholic Church, accepting that Thomas and Margaret were likely deceased, though their fate remained unknown. Both were declared legally dead in 1910, 7 years after their disappearance. Emma then searched for information about the families after 1903. Margaret's parents, John and Catherine Hayes, had died in 1918 and 1921 respectively, never learning what happened to their daughter. They had no other children. Thomas's parents, Michael and Rose Brennan, had 3 other children who survived to adulthood. The family remained in Bellefonte for several more generations, but none of them ever learned what happened to Thomas and Margaret. Emma looked again at the wedding photograph sitting on her desk. The young couple stared back at her across 116 years, frozen in a moment of hope and promise on the day they were married. She had no idea that the photograph itself held a clue that had been overlooked for more than a century. A clue that would finally suggest what really happened that night. Emma decided to have the photograph professionally restored. The image had deteriorated over 116 years. There was fading, some water damage in one corner, and age spots throughout. She wanted to preserve it properly and perhaps have copies made for other family members. She took the photograph to Daniel Kim, a professional photo restorer in Philadelphia who specialized in vintage and antique photographs. Daniel scanned the photograph at extremely high resolution, 9,600 dpi, to capture every detail before beginning restoration work. This level of detail was far beyond what the human eye could see when looking at the physical photograph. The scan is so detailed that you can see things that were invisible in the original print, Daniel explained to Emma. Texture in the paper, micro variations in tone, tiny details that the original photographer probably didn't even notice. Daniel began the digital restoration process, working to remove the water damage, correct the fading, and clean up the age spots while preserving the authentic character of the 1903 photograph. And then, 3 days into the restoration, Daniel called Emma. "You need to come to my studio," he said. "There's something in this photograph, something I don't understand." Emma arrived within an hour. Daniel had the restored image displayed on his large computer monitor. "Look at the background," he said, pointing to the painted studio backdrop behind the couple. Emma looked. She saw the formal parlor scene she had noticed before: painted columns, drapery, vague suggestions of furniture. "Now look here," Daniel said, zooming in on one particular area of the backdrop, behind and to the left of Thomas Brennan. Emma leaned closer to the screen. At first, she didn't see it. Then, as her eyes adjusted to what she was looking at, she felt the hair rise on the back of her neck. There was something in the painted backdrop, something that wasn't painted. It was a face, a human face, visible in the shadows of the painted drapery, partially obscured but unmistakably there. It wasn't painted. It was photographic. Someone had been standing behind the backdrop when the photograph was taken. At first I thought it was just pareidolia, Daniel said. You know, the human tendency to see faces in random patterns. But look, you can see details, eyes, a nose, the suggestion of a mouth. This is a real person standing behind that backdrop. Emma stared at the screen, her heart racing. Could it have been someone who worked at the studio? She asked. Maybe an assistant who was standing behind the backdrop by accident. That's what I thought, Daniel said. But then I looked at the rest of the background more carefully. He zoomed out slightly and pointed to another area of the backdrop, behind Margaret. There was another face, partially hidden in the painted shadows, barely visible even in the restored high-resolution scan, but definitely there. And then Daniel showed her a third face, and a fourth, and a fifth. There were at least 7 faces visible in the backdrop of the wedding photograph. 7 people standing behind the painted canvas, partially visible through gaps or thin areas in the painted fabric, all of them staring at Thomas and Margaret Brennan. "What the hell is this?" Emma whispered. Daniel pulled up another image on his screen, the back of the photograph, which he had also scanned. "There's more," he said. "Look at the inscription again." Emma had read the inscription before. Margaret Elizabeth Hayes and Thomas Michael Brennan. Married June 14th, 1903, St. John's Catholic Church. God protect them on their journey. "Now look underneath it," Daniel said, adjusting the contrast and exposure on the scan of the back of the photograph. Emma saw it immediately. Beneath the main inscription, written in much fainter pencil, so faint it had been invisible without enhancement, was another line of text. They were already there, waiting. Emma spent the next 2 weeks researching everything she could find about Robert Whitmore, the photographer who had taken the wedding portrait. What she discovered was disturbing. Robert Whitmore had operated his photography studio in Belafonte from 1898 to 1904. He had been well regarded locally, known for quality wedding and family portraits. But in December 1904, 18 months after photographing the Brennan wedding, Robert Whitmore had abruptly closed his studio and disappeared. His equipment was left behind. His accounts were settled, but he vanished overnight, leaving only a brief note to his landlord saying he was leaving Bellefonte permanently for personal reasons. He was never heard from again. Emma found one other disturbing detail. In 1903 and 1904, 2 other couples who had been photographed at Whitmore's studio had gone missing under unusual circumstances. Not as dramatically as the Brennans, no disappearing from moving trains, but both couples had simply vanished within weeks of their weddings, never to be found. Emma contacted a folklorist at Penn State University named Dr. James McAllister, who specialized in Pennsylvania supernatural folklore and urban legends. She showed him the restored photograph and explained the story. Dr. McAllister was silent for a long time, studying the faces in the backdrop. "There's an old piece of folklore," he finally said, "that I've encountered in various forms throughout Pennsylvania, particularly in the mountain regions. It's about photograph studios in the late 19th and early 20th centuries where something wrong was happening. The stories say that certain photographers made deals with entities, spirits, demons, whatever you want to call them. The photographer would mark certain clients, usually newlyweds, sometimes families with children. And on their wedding night, or within a short time afterward, these entities would come for them, take them somewhere else, another place, another dimension. The folklore is vague about the details, probably because there were never any survivors to tell what actually happened. The photographs themselves were supposed to serve as a kind of contract, or a beacon. By having your photograph taken by one of these cursed photographers, you were marked, and the entities would be able to find you, no matter where you went. Emma felt sick. You think that's what happened to my great-great-aunt? Dr. McAllister shook his head. I think that's what people in 1903 might have believed happened. Whether it's objectively true, there's no way to prove that. What I can tell you is that cases like this, unexplained disappearances associated with specific photographers, pop up repeatedly in folklore from this period. And there are documented cases of photographers who were suspected of involvement in disappearances, though nothing was ever proven. Emma went back to the photograph, now professionally restored and framed, hanging on her wall. She looked at Margaret and Thomas, young and hopeful on their wedding day, completely unaware that they had mere hours left before whatever happened to them on that train. And she looked at the faces in the backdrop. 7 shadowy figures standing behind the painted canvas, watching and waiting. Were they real? Were they some kind of supernatural entities? Or were they accomplices in something more mundane but equally sinister? Emma would never know for certain. But she knew one thing. When she got married next year, she would not be hiring a photographer. She and her fiancé had agreed to just take iPhone photos and call it good, because some traditions, Emma had decided, were better left in the past. The wedding photograph of Margaret Hayes and Thomas Brennan is now part of the collection at the Pennsylvania Historical Society, where it continues to puzzle researchers. The disappearance has never been solved. Subscribe for more stories of mysterious photographs and the secrets they hold.